Welcome to the Life Expansion After 50 podcast. Today's topic is the 7 fitness areas and dynamics of habit change. This is something I've been it's been lifelong, not as a profession, but rather an interest. The context around why I embarked on this work, it goes way back to, believe it or not, when I was 5 years old. I was literally teaching myself to ride a bicycle. And I would take the training, I was mechanically inclined as a kid. So I would take the training wheels off, try to ride, fall, put them back on and ride. And to take them off, I was going through that. And someone told me about an affirmation. I used the affirmation and instantly I rode the bicycle. That changed being 5 years old. I was still well in that conditioning period. 0 to 7 is heavy conditioning. We just learn as children, theta state 0 to 2, and then alpha state from 2 to 7. Of course, these are generalizations, but apparently that just went in, and I just stuck with this idea that I could use affirmations and accomplish things. And I tried it on everything. My track record was horrendous. It was disastrous. I kept doing it and trying it. Every once in a while it would work. And I tried it on school tests. I used it as shortcuts. I figure if I don't study and I do this, everything. Because it got locked into my conditioning. And this is one of the things I talk about, that I couldn't let it go. And later in my teens, I started noticing that things I was visualizing, not intentionally, just I was making a picture of the kind of person I wanted to be or the kind of bicycle I wanted. And next thing you know, I had that kind of bicycle. And that got my attention. So I got deep into it. I started reading all sorts of books that I could find. And I don't know why I didn't go to the library. It was more of a bottom-up kind of thing where someone introduced me to the book Think and Grow Rich. And then that led to another one, and that led to another one, and that I never stopped to think about going to the library and doing a search. There wasn't obviously Google, internet, or anything like in the 70s, so it was just word of mouth, and people, like the authors, would mention other books, and then there might be something in the bibliography, and then I would go look for that book. Fast forward to working, and that's where I pick up in this introduction. Welcome to the Life Expansion After 50, which is my podcast. Today's topic is the 7 fitness areas and dynamics of habit change. My journey with these principles began long before I entered the U.S. Army. And as I mentioned, in the Army, I became an officer and completed Ranger School despite the odds being against me. And I will say, when I went into the Army, I just committed to using these tools and principles and practices as much as I could, anytime I could, to get through it all, because I didn't know what I was getting into. And I would say I had great success. I became an officer. Not only that, I was the top officer in my class in the engineer officer course, which was significant because I didn't go to a military school. I had no military training at all. I used the principles. And so that really locked me in. But the same thing kept happening. I kept trying to use them in other places, and there was definitely a miss, and it just didn't work. And these experiences and others prior to joining the Army proved to me that the principles do work. Even though I found them difficult to teach, and too often they didn't work at all, I was motivated to understand why. That became sort of a new mission. Having read Think and Grow Rich and some other books along those lines, Magic of Thinking Big, Psycho-Cybernetics, etc., and also Clement Stone, Positive Mental Attitude, books by W. Clement Stone. I did see sales as a way to get out of New York City, if you will. So I did have this idea about selling because of something I felt would work. And I thought that I could use the principles to be a better salesperson. And I would say that they did work. But again, never all the time. But here's one example of something that did work, and it worked almost consistently. I used to sell life insurance. Using visualization, use visualization to set goals up. And again, they didn't always work. But one thing that worked often, and it became, in fact, two things that worked often, and they are mainstays, and it helped me shape the 7 fitness areas that I talk about today. One is, whenever I was in a sales presentation, and in selling life insurance, you want to go through a presentation because it's an emotional purchase. So you have to have the person into this sort of state. People don't just, maybe now, but not in the 80s. People don't just walk around saying, "Hey, I want to get a life insurance policy." But what would happen is if somebody, I felt like this sale was slipping away, I would start picturing in my mind while I'm talking, while I'm listening, I would visualize the person signing the check. That was very, very interesting to me because it did work and I didn't really understand why. But there's three parts of it. One is I calmed down, so there was no anxiety. And if you're in sales, business, whatever, you know, even as a leader, you know that sometimes that vibe, if you're anxious, you give off that vibe, and then it becomes harder for you to make the case because you're starting to close in. You don't see the possibilities. I think that's the second part of it. Visualizing, I'm opening myself up to more possibilities. And rather than going down this path of stalls and objections and using the same procedures that have always worked, I opened up and maybe picked up something. Now, this is a guess. I picked up something that maybe I was missing, and I would go down that path. And that was another part of it. So it's the relaxing and changing the vibe between the two of us. It's the picking up on other options that could work. And then the third one, which I didn't understand until I went through the neurochange course, which I'll talk about in a moment, about mirror neurons when I was interacting with the neuroscientist. But these mirror neurons is how we experience empathy. It's why when somebody yawns, other people start yawning. If you ski or snowboard and you're doing a trick or just skiing sometimes and somebody stumbles or falls, you can find yourself getting a little bit of a glitch. And I would say that that's the mirror neurons. Here's why. The mirror neurons, they found them because if you and I are talking and I raise my hand, like just raise my arm and hand, the areas of my brain that light up also light up in your brain, even though you don't move your hand. And that was powerful. Now, they're still studying this. There's not a lot known about it. But my guess is going back to that life insurance and visualizing them signing the check. My guess is that the mirror neurons came into play, and then there was some empathy because they knew I was making a sale, not for me, but for them, protecting the family from, in however you want to talk about it. So that was real powerful. The other thing that stuck with me, and I used to test this over and over because I sold financial services as well. It was all cold prospecting. Everything was cold prospecting, and I would literally go out door to door. Back in those days, we would go to the library and get a list of people by addresses. I forget the name of it, the books, and you would get all the addresses. You would know the name of every person on the street. And I would make that list, and I would literally go out and I would knock on the door and I would greet them by their name, which threw them off because how did this person know my name? And that would get me a chance to talk. Now, I never, and all the time I went door to door trying to sell financial services, never did I make a sale. But one of the things that happened every single time is that when I was going door to door during that period, I started making more sales from other places. That's a different story. There's things that you can relate to it. But if you're in sales and you've experienced this, know that you're not the only one. I would say the visualization of the check, you can do the same thing if it's online. You can visualize, like if you're on a Zoom call with somebody, you can visualize them nodding their head saying yes, and how do I sign up? You can visualize that completion. Anything that happens on the other side of them making the yes decision, I think you can visualize. And if it's you on your end, you can see yourself filling out the computer. That's something you could visualize. This is not about controlling them. This is about putting you in a state that is more conducive to helping them make that decision. So as I said, I was very motivated to understand why and to connect the dots on things like that. Why did it work sometimes and not others? So later I became certified in neurolinguistic programming, NLP. I was hoping that it would provide me tools. By that time I was in sales management and I would use it with the people who are on my team. And I wanted to use these concepts to find more consistency as well as get lower performers moved up and the mid performers moved up to the top. And of course, help the top performers and bring something to the table because I was in my 20s and most of the people under me were in their 40s and 50s and I needed more to bring to the table than just rah, rah, rah. Now, NLP is not a strategy or discipline on its own. It was a process of modeling. Bandel and Grinder in the 70s, it was a process that they used to model the best in class, and the focus was on behavior change. But they looked at what they do in police work and psychology work, and to understand this connection and its the nervous system, the language, and then the programming. So they looked at the language and the behavior, looking at it through a lens of conditioning. Think of it like a chef who's giving you a secret recipe. Now, you can replicate the dish, but understanding the principles behind it, that's a different matter. I was not a practitioner, but I worked. I went through a couple of certification programs, and I studied alongside practitioners. So I was often with doctors in these certification programs, but I would extrapolate what I needed, and again, to use it for building high-performing teams, for my own performance as well. Mainly sales, but later, as I got promoted and moved up, then I found myself doing large projects. So I was in project leadership, but it was all sales operations. So I was still working with salespeople, still in sales operations, but now it was projects. So I've used it in the operational realm. Then I was using it in the project realm. And what was nice about sales and project leadership is that I was able to measure results. These two areas, there you couldn't hide, right? There was no talk. You couldn't BS your way out of it because there were always metrics when it comes to sales and when it comes to projects. There were always metrics, and you can see, why did this work? Why did that work? When did it not work? And I ended up becoming the person who would resurrect failed projects. So in large corporations, oftentimes, and we're going to talk about it later on, you have to, your pivots are so big that it could be a 3-year event for that pivot. That becomes a very large national project. At the peak, we had 40,000 producers. And what would happen is some of these major projects that had to happen, I was able to resurrect them after they failed. They were always difficult. And because we're going into the unknown, right? You're going into an area that you don't know. People bring an operational mindset to the project, and now, but they're in project work. I was able to use these principles that I learned at that time from neurolinguistic programming, plus all the books, plus Army Ranger training taught me a lot in terms of getting past your limits, overcoming those limits, and then putting all that together. So it was a night, but again, it didn't always work. I hit ceilings, and I couldn't get through those ceilings. But it was a great testing ground, as I said, because of the results-oriented environment. Now, fast forward to a project that I led alongside a top consulting company. I set out to model the top leaders the same way I saw them do in neurolinguistic programming. Modeling top performers, they did it in various fields related to the mental and cognitive processing. I expected to find consistent principles and tactics from these leaders. Instead, the corporate leaders that we chose relied more on conditioning than on any set strategies or principles. It was very interesting because we couldn't find a thread that went through all of them. And Jim Collins later in his book, he did that work. He actually took reams of data and he created comparison companies and compared them to companies that made the inflection point. And that's what I was looking for. That's what I wanted to do with this study. But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. Leaders are hired and promoted based on their past accomplishments, which apparently, at least in some cases, are a product of their habits and conditioning. Still, seeking to solve the lack of consistency problem, I found Jim Collins' work, as I mentioned, and that good to great, and especially when he came up with the level 5, it was so unique. He came up with a new name called Level 5 Leadership, because he said there was nothing like it out there. The thing that he found as these companies were going across and they hit that inflection point and then just kept going, he said the brand of leadership that was in place at those companies that made the inflection point, and by the way, they continued for the standard for the criteria was 15 years. It was so unique, he came up with the new name, Level 5 Leadership. Today, I look at leader as coach for small business owners as a methodology to prepare as they scale and they have to add a leadership team, or they start with the general manager and then they build a leadership team. That owner has to delegate some kind of a leadership process or it'll become haphazard. What I start with is leader as coach, because leader as coach is a perfect on-ramp to level 5 leadership. Level 5 leadership, and if you've read the book Good to Great, you know it's a very difficult thing. People struggle with it. But the leader as coach is a nice way to move into that. So anyway, it reinforced the thing about conditioned behavior, because when you look at level 5 leadership, that thread is going through there. His other book, Great by Choice, highlights great companies that remained great during highly volatile periods. And that book I like to use as well because of the way they've done the research. The methodology included reviewing reams, as I said, reams of data for both comparison companies and the companies meeting their great criteria. And then they only kept the comparison companies and that made sense from the data and compared it. Now, continuing my search, I found the final missing piece of the puzzle, a NeuroChange certification program for practitioners. There, I learned from and interacted with neuroscientists, and that's the program that helped me complete my 7 Fitness Areas Framework. I actually found that course because I was working on the 7 Fitness Areas Framework and I was stuck. I couldn't close that gap between why it works and then why it doesn't, and that NeuroChange was provided the key that allowed me to go through the door. 7 Fitness Areas is a framework, a roadmap to help people shift from habits that don't serve them to those that align with their vision and life design. In the framework, the first 4 areas, mental, physical, spiritual, and emotional, are within our control, and I start there. Now, I'll focus on those 4 areas today as well. By mastering the associated skills, we can access the agency needed to design our ideal life and then live that life based on what we want in the areas of relationships, professional life, and financial outcomes, which are the last 3 areas. So the relationships, professional, and financial, I do spend time, and I will continue on the live events. So I've been covering the 7 Fitness Areas since March, focusing on the first 4, and now I'm pausing after emotional because that's the be and the do side, and then it's about having agency. In order to do the relationship, professional, financial, you have to have the personal leadership and agency. When I'm working with clients, that's a natural process that happens because I'm working through them. In these live events, we're not doing any work. I might be providing insights, but the point is you have to do something to regain and maintain agency in order to design that life that you're going to love living. And so later on, I'll continue doing these live events, but later on, I'll start getting into some of the principles. For example, I already use good to great and great by choice in the professional area, and I also use leader as coach and self-determination theory as the basis. Now, depending on who I'm working with, we may go in a different direction, but these are principle-based, and they're going to work no matter what, and then they provide on-ramps for wherever you're going to go. So the shift from have, do, be to be, do, have is at the core of the framework, and it contributes to the sustainability of the habit change process, and that's what I'll be talking about today. I'll walk you through this process in around 40 minutes, so it won't be comprehensive. During the presentation, I will introduce language that may be unfamiliar, but I ask you to hang in there and suspend judgment until I finish the first part of the program. I'll start with a quick summary here. In the mental area, we have fast and slow thinking. The physical area, we'll talk about, explore the difference between mental processing and neurobiological cognitive processing. Spiritual area is about the higher self in the context of the conscious mind and the subconscious. And lastly, the emotional area covers prevention and modulation strategies to prevent emotional hijacking and then quickly recovering when that prevention doesn't work and we find ourselves getting triggered or hijacked. Then I'll pull it all together by connecting the skills to personal leadership and agency. Now, it's going to be helpful to see this through a lens of quantum physics. You can have it, but you can take a screenshot of this. I have it bolded there. Newtonian physics is more about cause and effect. It's straightforward. Some of us talk about it as more linear. Quantum physics, on the other hand, it uncovers a more complex and less intuitive world. Quantum physics is where we get this idea that everything is atoms, and then you go to the next step and see that the atom itself is mostly energy, and the particle is placed in different parts, but the particle is only 0.0000001% of the entire atom. So when you start looking at the world through energy and atoms, it starts to pull the cover off of some of these things that may have been difficult to understand. We don't need to get deep into science, but I just want to make that point that if you find yourself struggling with some of the concepts, take a look at quantum physics. It might help to shed some light, or at least shift the paradigm. And so what I ask you to do in this session, at least for the next 45 minutes or so, is suspend judgment. Just, if it was true, what would my thoughts be about it? Kind of approach it like that, recognizing that after it's over, you can choose to reject the thing completely. So in the mental area, we have fast and slow thinking. If you think about survival reactions, that would be fast thinking. Thoughtful responses would be slow thinking. Now, Daniel Kahneman, the author of Fast and Slow Thinking, I read this book back in 2012. I found it fascinating. I went back and listened to the book more recently because I saw the connection to this, what I was working on, and he didn't get quite to this point that I'm going to make when I get into the physical area. Most people have fallen off of something. You may have fallen off of at the playground, or maybe you were in an accident or something, and you have this experience where your life seems to flash before your eyes. That's like super fast thinking. So the unconscious brain can process at 11 million bits per second. And the way I look at that flashing through my field of vision is my unconscious is looking for some kind of survival reaction to apply right now. If you've ever seen a kid, a toddler about to fall, and they just like a cat, they just twist themselves in midair, avoid hitting their head, and it's like amazing. That's that unconscious working. That's fast thinking. That didn't go through a reaction process. It was just instantaneous, and that's fast thinking. Slow thinking, on the other hand, is conscious processing. I mentioned the unconscious and brain process at 11 million bits per second. The conscious mind only processes at 50 bits per second. So you can imagine, even at a half second in, the conscious mind is just getting started, whereas the unconscious could have processed up to, 5.5 million bits of information. Then we have conscious thought. I call it the gateway to limitless possibilities. When you start looking at things that everything is atoms and you look at the possibilities, I look at that as the field of complete possibility. The visualization I was using when I first started learning this work to figure it out is like going through a doorway and there's just vast nothingness. And I would imagine myself taking a step and then the ground would form underneath me. And as I took another step, the ground would start forming faster and faster as I walked into this field. But then because I was also visualizing the outcome, which is the 7 fitness areas, things would start to take shape out ahead of me. I was no longer waiting for the ground to unfold before I had to take another step. It was actually unfolding faster and faster because of the type of visualization. That's what I did. No, I didn't learn that from anywhere. It was just experimenting. I used to spend a lot of time experimenting to see what worked. That worked for me. It may work for you, but there's no science behind it other than it gave me some confidence to step into the unknown, because the unknown is scary to the unconscious. And it makes sense. So a lot of this goes back to hunter-gatherer days, so it makes sense. And the last one is important, the importance of deliberate decision-making and habit formation. Now, I want to split this thing. One is in operational area, and that's where most businesses are focusing on. Operational excellence is important. It makes sense that you can use fast thinking there because you're already confined by the operations. Whereas when you're building a new project, it's like the field of possibility is completely open. If you rely on fast thinking and when you're in the field of possibility, you're probably going to be guessing wrong. What you have to do is use your conscious thinking, because the conscious thinking can connect the dots and it sees the possibility. So when I talk about decision making and habit formation, I'm talking about moving into this project space. And the reason why that makes sense is because you've probably heard of the term VUCA, V-U-C-A, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. That's just increasing. And I can, just to simplify it, Moore's law goes back to, actually it started in the 60s, and he said technology will double every 12 months. It was later revised in the 70s to be every 18 months. And he was basing it on chip size. I would argue that we're still seeing that compounding effect, technology accelerating and doubling perhaps every 18 months. And if you look at a compound curve, we are on that vertical part of the curve. You know, you've seen compounding, it's moving slow. Like a penny doubled. If you double a penny every day for 30 days, it turns into a $10 million. Anyway, it starts slow and then it just goes straight up. And if you look at Moore's law going back to 1972, I think it was, when they revised it to every 18 months, and you do that compounding curve, we are definitely in that vertical section of it. So things are going fast, and that explains the VUCA. You look at deep fakes in AI and you recognize how far that's going to be, what that's going to look like at 5 years from now. So we're having to adjust more and more and more rapidly, and that means more and more projects. In fact, projects, I don't think they need to be these big things. They need to be quick pivots. We need to be able to move quickly and be nimble and use a lot of testing and trial and error. I could go on, but one of the things I talk about in the professional area is we have tools now where you could literally, I could literally build a landing page and connect it to the internet and send traffic to it. I could probably complete that step in those steps in a half hour. Of course, I already have the URL, and those things were already in place. But to do rapid testing rather than build a whole new technology application and hire consultants, let's just do some testing. Just to do some testing, get it done, and then once you have the data, now you can actually bring the conscious mind in to make some good decisions. But if you think about fast thinking and you consider that the unconscious and slow thinking as the conscious, first I want to talk about the unconscious. The unconscious has a reaction time of about 200 to 250 milliseconds. So think about it as 0.2 of a second, 0.2 to 2.5 of a second between stimulus and response. And this is the traditional way of looking at stimulus and response. And that stimulus, think of it as the cue. If you've read Atomic Habits, he talks a lot about the cue. So I would say the stimulus and the cue in this context is the same. In between that space has often been assumed to be out of our control, partly because it was assumed that it was all in the mind. And I'm going to show what happens when we get to the physical area, that it's not. It's not in the mind. And that's the first major breakthrough in talking about this. I also would say that this stimulus response, it's more like muscle memory. Most people have heard of muscle memory and you've experienced it. Instead of muscle memory, think of it as nervous system memory. In other words, that same principle that's at play with teaching you to do something with the muscles, you can teach yourself to have that change with how you speak, facial expressions, how you interact with people. If you're doing video, your mannerisms, all of that can be thought of as in this realm of possibility for changing, because you can use nervous system memory. Same principles, deep practice is what it comes down to. And you can even to stop yourself from being triggered. Here's some quick reaction time examples. Cats, you've seen cats, they're probably some of the fastest things that we see, 20 to 70 milliseconds. So it's less than 1/10 of a second. That cat, and you've seen it. If you've seen the cucumbers or when they're interacting with the snake, it's like instantaneous. Dogs are more like 100 to 200 milliseconds. Humans, on the conscious side, is 300 to 500 milliseconds. So think about a half a second. But the unconscious, as I said, is 200 to 250. But if you take like Formula One drivers, and I would say many of your athletes who are trained, who have to react, football players, etc., basketball players who have to react quickly, they're closer to like what the dogs are with the 100 to 150 because they've trained. And that gets to the myelin. So myelin wraps the neuron and makes the neuron not only fire faster, so the impulse travels through the neuron faster, but also it's quicker. So in other words, from the stimulus to the actual start of that impulse, it gets faster because of the myelin. So it's faster and it's quicker. I wanted to make that distinction. Here's what I do when I'm working with somebody. What I recommend you do when you start thinking about habits. But I put this reaction space in there. It's where things are actually happening. Traditional way of thinking about it was not to have that reaction, to go stimulus response. But when you put that reaction in there and you start asking yourself, what can I do? That's where you can start making some choices. So conscious processing, you have the response time, as I said, about a half a second. You still have that reaction, and then you have the response. Now, this is where the conscious mind can start coming into play. But if you're already into an unconscious response, you're already triggered, what have you, then your conscious response could be shifted. It could be contaminated by that triggering. However, if we're going into the unknown, this is what I was talking about earlier, we want to change it to just a data point. If I'm in operations, I may take this reaction and give it more weight. It might have 80% weight in terms of what my response will be. But if I'm in the field of the unknown, if I'm doing something new I've never done before, this reaction may only have a 10 or 20% weight because I need to stay in my conscious mind. That's the way to think about this. That's why I put this reaction in there. It's not a one size fits all. It's when I'm in operational stuff, when I know what I'm doing, then if I've done it before, like the book Malcolm Gladwell, Blink, I can rely on that fast thinking, which is not thinking at all, by the way. That's the point I'm making. It's not thinking at all. It's cognitive processing because it's happening in the unconscious. The conscious mind thinks. The unconscious processes associations. But when I'm in that field of possibilities, I want this to be a smaller data point, and I want to spend time on the response. The good news is that we're not talking about minutes here. We're talking about a half a second to a second. The other thing I'm going to add in is the pre-stimulus. James Clear does talk about this in Atomic Habits because he talks about the identity. You have an identity. Whatever your identity is in that pre-stimulus. But there's other things in there as well, which I'll get into in the next slide. So the pre-stimulus is going to influence the stimulus. That's going to influence your reaction. So a person who's triggered, it could have been set up way back in the pre-stimulus part. But then once you're triggered, the cortisol is running through your body and, on and on. So now we got the physical area. I'm going to come back to that slide. Energy commands matter. So I talked about everything as atoms. You've got the atom is mostly energy, 99.9999999% energy. Energy commands matter. The unconscious is a physiological network of neurons. We have 100 billion neurons, 86 billion neurons are in the brain, another 14 billion are throughout the body. When you start talking about myelin wrapping neurons, this was another one of those breakthrough areas when I read the Talent Code and understood about myelin. It started opening the door for me. That was well before I went through the Neural Change Practitioner certification. When you get to the point of seeing the unconscious as neurobiological processing, and then you can actually recognize that we have mental cognitive processing and we have physiological cognitive processing. And you can discern the difference. Now, in the beginning, I say just look at speed. The unconscious processing is so much faster. You can just sheerly go with speed. If you have an instantaneous reaction, chances are it's coming from the unconscious. When it's thoughtful, and you can even feel it, like if you ask yourself, why does this always happen? An answer comes up right away. That's you can do other things. What else is going on? What's a good way to approach this? What are 3 or 4 things? Kind of like you do with artificial intelligence, with ChatGPT or whatever you use. Ask it different prompts and you'll get better information. That's why I say the quality of the question will improve the quality of the information that you get and your action. Conscious attention shapes reality because attention directs energy. Where I put my attention, that's where my energy goes. One of the things that you can do in that stimulus response, if you're seeing some kind of a stimulus that has a triggering effect on you, let's say you're in the middle of the work, you really haven't gotten to the other side yet. Once you're to the other side, you'll have tools that doesn't even come into play. But let's say you're still you're working through it and you see something that has a triggering impact. You can look away and look over here. If you do it fast enough, you stop those neurons from firing. The way I look at neurons is it's like mob behavior. There's 100 billion of them. And 100 billion of anything is a lot. Because everything is atoms, there's a lot of fractal relationships going on. Scientists learn things from our cells that relate to our behavior, and they learn things from our behavior that relate to our cells. So there's some fractal view going on there. If you think about the neurons as a mob, it starts to make sense. Okay, so you're getting triggered. You're looking at this triggering thing. The neurons start firing, and you can see they start firing and bringing more in. When you change your focus and look at something else, literally look for something else, or you can change it internally. You can flash a picture in front of you, literally flash a new picture. It changes your attention, it changes your reaction, etc. So fast thinking is physiological. Cognitive, but the challenge is mental thought and conditioned impulse. They're both energy, and that energy can feel the same. So you have to learn to discern the difference. Visualization works because it's a form of deep practice. It's also going at the senses. And I'll tie into the law of attraction. Law of attraction became popular in the 1800s. I think it gets distorted because people are trying to figure it out. So when they came up with it in the 1800s, we certainly didn't have the brain imaging equipment that we do today to see what parts of the brain are lighting up and make correlations. And so it gets distorted because people think that it's happening out there, that I'm doing this visualization and I'm attracting this thing to me. And they describe it as I manifested this and the universe gave me me that. And when I started with the 7 fitness areas, one of the stakes I put in the ground was I was not going to rely on any woo-woo. Now, that doesn't mean I do have 100% aligned that there's a spiritual realm, and we have a role with that with respect to that spiritual realm. But in the 7 fitness areas, I wanted to move that out of it because I think people put too much into the universe. Everything is universe, 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 and it takes the responsibility, it takes it out of play because it's the universe. The universe didn't give it to me. I guess it wasn't due. Well, that's not the way I see it. Well, I have this example of the woo-woo gap. And then I already talked about muscle memory is more like nervous system memory. This is a big step towards learning how all this stuff comes together. There's the pause. I mentioned that we can put a pause in. This pause can be a half a second, it could be a second, it could be another day. One of the things I help clients with is if they're in a triggering event, that pause, I actually have them remove themselves. An example might be, let's say that a tough question comes in and you're not ready to deal with it and it has some energy to it and maybe you're feeling yourself getting triggered. Rather than deal with it now, say, you know what, that's a great question. I want to spend some more time hearing your point of view on it and have some dialogue because it's something we're working through right now, and then set up a meeting. You can actually set that up as a cue, as a stimulus response. If you don't do that, when you're already near being triggered, you'll find this pre-stimulus causing more triggering to happen. You'll blow right through the pause because your reaction is to answer, and next thing you know, you've made a decision, and that decision becomes an action. Some of the things that can come in that pre-stimulus, I already mentioned identity. I think identity is a big part of it. Tony Robbins talks about identity in a big way. None of these things are panaceas, in my opinion. The panacea, if there's a panacea for me, it's understanding the difference between mental processing and physiological processing. That's a big one. And then the other one is learning to put a pause between stimulus and response. And that's where you exercise your agency. If you take away nothing else, those are the two big things. But understanding some of the other factors makes sense. So priming, cognitive biases, social influence, all these things get in the way. Discomfort, and the environment, the culture, where you're paying attention, what you're paying attention to, what you're focusing on, your mood, your anxiety. And that's another thing. Once you start getting a handle on this, you may exit from, just take a break, get away from your work. If you're not in the right frame of mind, you can't build great stuff out of a place of fear and lack. So you've got to get back to a good place. And that could be getting away from it. And later on, I'll talk about neuroplasticity and how that happens. Right, in the spiritual area, we have connecting with your higher self. It taps into a purpose-driven design for your life. This is not spiritual outside of ourself, as I said. It's the part of us that interacts with the spiritual. Later on, I will talk about the woo-woo gap. And again, I want to focus on the non-woo-woo, but the more I can understand what's going on in the entire space, the more I can make this accessible to people. And by using no woo-woo as a standard, it forces me to focus on things that people can control. The powerful present moment is a big thing that we can control. That's that moment. That's why I have you pause. And that's why I pause. It only has to be a half a second. It doesn't have to be much. Moments can be very small, but that powerful present moment is the combination of your thought, and we want purity of thought. We want the mind functioning, not distracted with the anxiety from the future or regrets from the past. We want the mind to be pure, and then we want consciousness, and consciousness should always be pure. That's our higher self. And that last bullet says awareness of awareness. It's the proxy that I use for consciousness. Awareness of awareness. It gets us a long way. So this is what I'm saying here. Awareness of and by, not just that you have a higher self, but you want awareness by the higher self. So I've got this imagery of the going meta. You can actually do this. You've been in a some disagreement with somebody. You think that they're mostly at fault or that you're right and they're wrong. It's interesting, just in your mind. First come out of yourself. Now you're seeing both of you talk. Then you go behind them and look over their shoulder at yourself talking. Look at your facial expressions. Listen to how you're coming across. Continue with that conversation. Go neutral. This is a powerful present moment thing. So pure, you just want to be objective. Consciousness is the awareness. Clear mind, no regrets, no anxiety, and then the thought is empty. You're just observing, just paying attention to what's going on. Take a look at that. You might find that there's some things that you're missing because of your maybe reacting or something like that. I did this a lot when I was learning to argue the other side. I got to the point where I wanted to argue the other person's point of view better than they could. I got that from Jerry Spence. He was called the winningest lawyer of all times. His book was How to Argue and Win Every Time. I thought it was going to be some skills, teach some skills about arguing. His whole thing was argue the other party point better than they can, and then using that information, you can come to win-win. I talk about this rule gap. So this is a ruler, 12 inches from here, because there's a little bit of free edge on the end. And this is 12 inches, so it's 1 inch here, the beginning of the ruler, and then I have this other green marker located at 11. And the idea is that if we're not careful, this whole thing could be a woo-woo gap. This whole thing could be our gap of what we think is the universe. What I have done with the 7 Fitness Areas framework is I've collapsed this. I can take virtually everything that's talked about on law of attraction and break it down into things that are in our control, what's going on in the 7 fitness areas. That's why I have it as set up that way. I spent a lot of time working on the order, etc., but between the mental, physical, spiritual, and emotional, and then the mirror neurons, I don't have proof of that yet because they're still doing research, but there are some things that I think get attributed to the universe that can be explained by mirror neurons. And I would say you as an individual, how wide is your woo-woo gap, and why is it that wide? And it's not to say there is no spiritual realm. There's very much a spiritual realm. What I'm saying is our part of it is very small. In this context, it's from the 11 to 12. And then we have the major spiritual realm, of course, that's undefinable as far as I'm concerned. That's the spiritual area. Then the next one is the emotional area. And more than any other area, the emotional can make a difference both ways. You can get hijacked and triggered, or you can use it to drive commitment and action. So I call it the gateway. On the 7 fitness areas, as you saw, it's in the middle. It's the gateway to the right side, relationships, professional and financial. Prevention is one side. Now this is a positivity exercise, and I'll do that in the Q&A. I'll demonstrate that. But the positivity exercise, in less than 6 weeks, you can literally train your unconscious, because remember, it's physiological. And the same way you can train muscle memory, you can train cue, reaction, response. And you can train, and the pre-stimulus. So the positivity exercise gets to the pre-stimulus part. It's before the stimulus happens. So we're actually pre-cue. We're training our unconscious. This is, to me, is better than the identity piece, because the identity, you work to change the identity. But when we train the unconscious to scan for positives instead of scan for negatives, it's a game changer. Because you get a phone call, you see the name on it, left to its own devices, the unconscious will see that phone call coming in as worst case scenario. If you're a parent with kids who recently moved out, you know what I'm talking about. They call, and the first thing is, hope nothing happened, right? When you retrain and this happens though across imagine every letter, every phone call, every customer, every weird expression that you see, all of this stuff, every geopolitical event, it can take on this, what's the worst case scenario? So by training your unconscious to look for the positive, we go a long, long way. That's a big step in the that's called the positivity exercise. That's the prevention. Then the next one is modulation. Modulation is processing the emotion. When those triggering events happen, you can still recover. Ideally, because we're doing the positivity exercise, because we have the pre-stimulus in check, because we're having a pause, we should not be getting triggered. We might have an emotional response, and by modulating that emotional response, and it happens in seconds, not minutes. By modulating that emotional response, you let it pass through, and then you move on with your response, which then can become a decision and an action. But when you do get triggered, emotional modulation also comes into play, because you can turn it around. So processing allows it to pass through, and I use a label. I say you locate the emotion, you label it, give it a name, and then you learn from it. If you don't label it, it's all anxiety, and anxiety is just going to fire more and more neurons. So you locate it. Where is it? Where do I feel it? That starts forcing you to look at it objectively and to kind of take a step back and getting out of that trigger mode. And then you label it. What is this emotion? Is it frustration? Is it disappointment? Is it anger? Or is it just embarrassment, right? You start and you come up with the label for it, and then you learn, what is this emotion telling me? We call it surfing the emotion. What you don't want to do is suppress it, because if you suppress the emotion, it becomes a feeling, and once it's a feeling, it's lodged into your network of neurons, and once that happens, it can now be called up on cue by stimuli that come either from internally or externally. So as I was saying, you surf the emotion, you don't suppress it. The other thing that happens when you suppress it is that you fall into this trap of also suppressing positive emotions. Once you start suppressing emotions, think of it as more of a switch. You turn off the switch, and now you're putting the positive emotions and you're storing the negative emotions as well. The problem is we tend to have more negative emotions than positive ones, and unless you've done some intervention. And so the negative ones are more easily called up, more easily than the positive ones. So the 8 negative emotions, this came from Joan Rosenberg. You see in the bottom references from the book 90 Seconds to a Life You Love by Joan Rosenberg. Sadness, shame, helplessness, anger, embarrassment, disappointment, frustration, and vulnerability. Those are the 8 emotions that she says all your negative emotions can be labeled as one of those. And the reason she does that is she wants to give people agency so that they're not scared of the future. We don't want people worrying that something's going to hit them that they can't handle. By adopting these skills and understanding, modulating your emotions, you shouldn't have that fear that there's going to be something that you can't handle. So you surf the emotion. This is the 90 seconds. That's why the name of the book is 90 Seconds to a Life You Love. You surf the emotion. You rise up to that crest, locating it, you're labeling it, and then you're learning from it. And you'll find that it starts to subside. The emotions are there to teach us something. What I learned from the neuroscientists is that the reason why they exist in the first place, back to the hunter-gatherer, imagine being in a tribe. There's no language. Somebody bites into a piece of fruit or some kind of a vegetable or plant, and instantly the members can see the expression on the face. They know if it's good or bad. The face is the only place on the body where the skin is attached directly to the muscle. There's nothing in between, and that's so that our facial expressions show up right away. And that's this idea of the 90 seconds pass through. They were never meant to be dwelled upon and harbored. It just passes through. Once the emotion is through, okay, we learn from it, now on to the next one. So you'll learn to modulate that. Using the positivity exercise gives you some space, and then you do the modulation exercise as well, because you got to process a lot of emotions that have been stored, and so we have to work through that. By the way, none of this is mental health. This is all about business. It's all about higher performance in business and then leading others, but it's not mental health. Pulling it all together, the first 4, as I've mentioned a few times, you're not control. I paused here because I wanted to focus on agency rather than jump into the relationship, professional, and financial. And that's where we should have experts. I should have experts coming in helping me out with this content. But again, it should be prescriptive based on what you're on your life design. But we can control these 4, and we use the tools from the 7 Fitness series to do that. The objective is to maintain agency even when things are going crazy all around you. By becoming the person who's ready to live that life that you design, you're stepping into a place of no longer being hijacked. You can change habits easily, sometimes with only awareness. There are often times where I'm able to change a habit just by becoming aware. I don't have to use swish patterns. I don't have to use change. I don't have to use reframing. It just happens automatically because my higher self has this connection with the subconscious. If you take this idea that 95% of our lives are run by habit, the subconscious has become here and the conscious mind is here. And now we probably have the higher self, but we have the higher self trying to interact with the unconscious. But that's like putting the fox in charge of the hen house. The unconscious is reacting so quickly, it's pinging the conscious mind, and the conscious mind is interfering with the awareness. And that's what I said, we want that purity. We don't want our present moments to be contaminated. What we're doing is we're moving the subconscious. Sub is below, right? We're putting the subconscious below the conscious mind. So now we have the higher self, we have the conscious mind, and then we have the subconscious. And that's why sometimes with simple awareness, I can make the change. I might do something internally where I might make a picture and then switch the picture as a reminder, as a cue, because we still want to train the unconscious to do it. There's other neurons that may come into play, but it's definitely easier to get back on course if you've been knocked off. Rising above the line is where the infinite possibilities reside. It's important to have an understanding of what it takes to cross that line and then thrive above the line. You can't thrive when you're plagued with survival reactions. We all have an artificial ceiling, I'll call it the upper limit. Conditioning tells us that what's above the line is not available to us because of whatever reason, fill in the blank. We also have an artificial floor, I'll call it the lower limit. Our conditioning tells us that if we fall below this line, it's over. Rising above the line, people find themselves living in the zone. Not too much, not too little. It's a comfort zone. You go up too high, you get uncomfortable. You get too low, you get uncomfortable. The upper limit is not just a line, it's more like a barrier. And in this barrier, we have this space, and this is why it's so difficult to get across. When you talk to people who've gone through this, they can describe the experience. Very few people can talk about how they did it, and that's what the 7 Fitness is and why I came up with it, because what I noticed is people who were above that, they all had a similar experience, but what was different is how to get there. Some people use meditation, some people use shock, they lost everything, whatever it is, but there is a process, and that's what we talk about in the 7 Fitness series. And you see we have stories, bad experiences, violence, good experiences, habit patterns, things our teachers told us, things our parents told us, things our sisters and brothers told us, things we saw in the neighborhood. The reason I have good experience with the stars, because that can get into this thing, this is cousin of willpower. I don't want power. There might be something that was so pleasurable that you never ever want to do something else. And so good experiences could actually be in here too. Sometimes we got to get past that. Then we have crossing the line can take a lifetime. The quote, Judson Brewer, the biggest obstacle to habit change is habit itself. And that's what inspired me to put this webinar together. Literally, when I started thinking about that quote, I said, okay, we actually have to, before we can do this work about changing habits, we have to learn how to break the habit of being governed by habit. Now, that doesn't mean that in the future I don't want to have my life 85 to 90% by habit. I want those habits to be designed and aligned with my future, the life that I design, not some random thing that was brought up at 0 to 7 when computers weren't even in homes. Rising above the line, crossing the barrier creates cognitive dissonance, and this is because we're doing something that we believed was impossible, this brain fog. It's actually neuroplasticity at work. Breaking through means breaking from the past. There can be deep-seated beliefs, and as we go through these deep-seated beliefs, we're getting all these pings of danger, and you're going to die, and all this other stuff, and that's that anxiety that we feel as we're going across the line. The challenge is that it may not be anxiety, it's just, as I said, cognitive dissonance, which can feel like brain fog, but also excitement, which will occur as you're going above the line because you're actually accomplishing it. Anxiety and excitement can have the same signature. And if you are not careful in learning to focus on the right thing, in a game of tennis, in a game of golf, they talked about focusing. Now I understand. But it's not about controlling what I'm thinking about. It's about having the right perspective and the right cue so that when the cue happens, I focus on the positive, the excitement part of it rather than the negative. That's why the positivity exercise is important. But this is the literally neuroplasticity in action. And when you get that brain fog, I would say get away from the work and just go to bed. Or when you're, get away from the work. And then when you go to bed, because as you're sleeping, you'll accelerate the neuroplasticity because you're not getting other cues coming in, and you wake up with a whole new outlook. And it's almost like the neurons that were preventing you from going above the barrier, once you get above the barrier, now they're helping you thrive. So they go from being scared and worrying about survival to now helping you thrive. This reminds me of the 3 feet from goal story in the Think and Grow Rich. I think it's also important to know when to fold. And you have to be able to discern and be objective, right? And so by being objective, you're not looking at every problem as I'm just 3 feet from gold and keep going. And that's where I come up with start with purpose. If you start with purpose and you're focusing on your purpose, because your purpose comes from the heart and it's going to be about serving other people, the need to serve the other people to serve other people remains. How you get there is strategy. You can change the strategy, but the purpose part of it, I would stay with, if that makes sense. And passion does not have that ability, in my opinion, to carry you through the tough times like purpose does. Passion is other ways I can scratch that itch, but purpose is usually just one way, and that's why people can devote their life to it. So here's what we're talking about. You got the below the line. We don't see that a lot, and it's scary when you get there. We have this inflection point, and that's similar to what Jim Collins talks about in his book, Good to Great. Then we have the strengths, consistency, and simplicity. And the unfamiliar and the unknown are threats to the unconscious. That's what makes it so hard up here. So rather than and think about SWOT analysis, SWOT, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. We want to, obviously you've already taken care of the weaknesses, but now we're going to focus on our strengths, but we focus on consistency and simplicity. And Good to Great, you can think of this as the flywheel, turning that flywheel every day, big, heavy, massive flywheel. And then the simplicity is the hedgehog concept if you go back to Good to Great. You have the unfamiliar and you have the unknown. And I'm not going to say ignore those, but understand that usually you're going to have reversion to the mean. And if you stay with your strengths, consistency, and simplicity, the VUCA tends to have less of an effect. So there's going to be opportunities and threats out there, shiny things that you want to chase. There's always going to be VUCA noise, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. Again, you don't ignore it, but you check it. Yep, still within the realm. Go. When it starts to get out of the range of acceptable, then you maybe take action. And I would say as you're crossing the barrier, it may be something more like this, where your lows are getting higher. You may not see any progress for a while. This could be 3 months. You're not seeing any progress. Don't give up. You're meditating, whatever it is you're doing. You're breathing, you're walking, you're exercising, you're changing your diet. There's a lot of things that have to happen. Remember, I don't know how much stuff is in here. PTSD, all sorts of things could be in there that are stopping you from getting across here. And I kind of switched from talking about a company to a person, but it's similar because a company is a group of people and culture is like conditioning. And then we have, once you're above the line and you're following this like turning the flywheel, is that following the example. And I drew these vertical lines. These vertical lines are like the projects and the pivots that you make, and then the green lines are like the operational excellence. So you keep moving forward with the operational excellence until you get to the constraint. As you get to your constraint, it's time to, okay, now we're going to go to a different market, or now we're going to create a new service, or now we're going to develop a new tier. And this is what I was referring to when I said you can test, because we don't know all this stuff out here. There's so much noise. Rather than pay consultants to do all that legwork, just test it. Get yourself somebody on your team who can build landing pages real quick. Easy to run traffic. So easy to run traffic to a landing page. You can test it. There are things you can do to see how things are working, to inform before you start spending money. In the book Great by Choice, Jim Collins' follow on to Good to Great, where he looked at the companies that were able to stay great in times of great volatility, he talks about bullets then cannons. So this quick testing I'm talking about is bullets. And the context is that ships fighting against each other would shoot cannons and rise above the line. So this is the example of the comparison companies. So they took all these companies that were going along. They found a company that at an inflection point, they outperformed the comparison companies and did so consistently for 15 years. And then they looked at the other companies that kept going as planned. And so they eliminated other companies that didn't make sense. And then they compared what was going on at this inflection point with this company that made the leap that wasn't existing in those other companies. And that's the Good to Great point of view. And this image summarizes expectations when you follow the roadmap. Again, mental, physical, spiritual, and emotional. We're doing the part that's in our control, and then we have to use that agency to design the life that we want to live, create the life that we want to live, and then love living that life. And you're doing that because we're using the right combination of conscious thinking, and you've trained your unconscious to scan for the positive instead of the negative, because most threats that we're running into are not the Serengeti tiger. Now, obviously, if you're in war or a situation like that, it's going to be different. But for most of us in business, every single threat is not a Serengeti level threat. That's it. We'll see you in the next live. Take care.